Well, welcome everyone here at the CRF IMD live session on thriving after crisis. My name is Mark Greeven. I'm joined here with Howard.
And I'm Howard Yu. Great to meet every one of you. As being earlier mentioned, you're more than welcome to type in question and we'll take off the question as we go along. And the idea is we better leverage all this virtual mode of learning so that as much as we give you the information, we would love you to be able to have a lateral conversation. And we would keep on answering the question being raised in the chat box. And if needed, we'll bring across and so that we can have a more in-depth conversation as well.
Exactly. And maybe we can start off with this conversation, Howard. So because I think you've just gotten back from Hong Kong, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
So that's a challenging environment now, isn't it?
Yeah, from both of course, everywhere is being embroiled with COVID, as well as in Hong Kong is the the uncertainty around the political environment and all the implication around tech giant as well. Some of you may have heard TikTok have stopped rolling out in Hong Kong. And then there are all these hanging questions. How do tech company can navigate this very turbulent environment, both from a business angle as well as political perspective?
Exactly. And I think this uncertainty and turbulence is one of the core components of our session today, where we're going to figure out how can you actually thrive on uncertainty and crisis? So with that, and again, I would like to really encourage you to ask questions. We really hope it's a conversation, but we start with a question to you, which is really a poll. And I would like to ask Athena here to share the poll. The question really is very simple. How confident are you of your organization's capability to thrive after this crisis? And from very confident to slightly confident to completely not confident, please share your, fill it in. And I see here we have roughly 40%. So let's see everybody else. Please cast your votes here. Oh, I see some really interesting results, actually. Yeah, that is very interesting. And yeah, nobody changing their minds. I think we are good. I think we are really good. So thanks, Athena. I think we can stop the poll and we can share the results. So can everybody see the results? Yes, exactly. Very good. So interesting. Many of you are mostly confident, and that's a very good positive energy, I think, for this session. And we also see quite a number of people that are slightly confident and some, not really confident. So what we'd like to do in this session is really to take the confidence into action. So what can we actually do with that confidence, and maybe turn around some of the less confident organizations towards more, more confident, eventually to be able to thrive on in this crisis and after this crisis. So I think we can stop sharing the results. Athena, thank you. So if we look at these results, yes, there will be clearly winners, losers, and undecideds in this crisis. And sometimes the winners are easy to identify. Probably companies that are dealing with necessities of life are probably going to come out of this crisis fairly well. The losers probably are also fairly obvious in the way, if they deal with mobilizing a mobility, moving people around, this is a tough time. But the group of undecideds is probably the largest group, and in a way also a very interesting group, because then we can see if we can move the undecideds towards the winners here. Now, having said that, this crisis has and is having a very important consequence already, and it's actually kind of showing and exposing some of the weaker companies that were perhaps not so well prepared for the future, in particular not so well prepared for some of the bigger trends. Think about the digitalization, for instance, and kind of have exposed those weaknesses that now become actually fairly costly and very challenging. The thing is, this crisis kind of functions as what Warren Buffett calls, it's like when the tide goes out, you discover who is swimming naked. This crisis basically is showcasing, some of the weaker companies. However, and here I'm gonna ask Howard again, is some companies do better than others, and the recovery has been fairly uneven. So Howard, could you share us a couple of examples?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there is this misconception that it's only the tech giants are winning. And if there's one thing I want people to remember, it truly is not only Amazon and Google and Facebook are winning. Across each of these sectors, if you're looking at industry incumbent, there is certain hallmark that distinguish organization that recover is growth prospect or fortune much more ahead of others. And if you simply take the stock price, for instance, that becomes quite a staggering effect. Now, first go to auto industry, and we already see how organizations that are positioned for the future are recovering much more than others. For instance, if you're looking at the auto industry, obviously, for a longest time, this demand and supply has been having a dampening effect. I remember back in February, for instance, Hyundai is already stopping its production line in South Korea, not because COVID is hitting South Korea, but simply their supply chain wasn't prepared for that future. As a result, they missed the most critical spare part from China. So one small little part can stop the whole production line in South Korea. The same thing actually happened for BMW, VW, GM, as well as Toyota, the largest car maker on the face of the planet. Now, of course, you kind of already can guess who's on top, right? And of course, that's Tesla. Now, you may have this feeling, well, Tesla is just being crazy out there. I mean, it's just the stock market is being irrational. So let's take a look of another sector. Let's look at the banking sector. Because if you're thinking about banking, everyone is thinking about mobile payment or mobile services. They were talking about direct to end consumer, robo-advisory, right? AI or blockchain. From that perspective, you would imagine the digital native, such as Square or PayPal, would be doing quite well because this is what they're building up for. However, what I notice in this situation is not just, again, the digital native are winning. In fact, you have also industry incumbent are doing rather well. However, there's a cautionary tale. If you are transforming your business too slow, despite you have the great vision, it's not enough. And these are the traditional bank, retail bank, or even mobile payment system that haven't transformed themselves quick enough, like American Express, Wells Fargo, or Bank of America. The interesting thing is, even when you are industry incumbents, such as Visa and Master, in these circumstances, they have pretty much recovered their lost ground. Again, the time frame we're talking about here is early part of the January. We pick it on January 20, when the very first COVID patient passed away in China, as the beginning of the crisis, and track almost like, about 2 weeks ago. Now, but it's not just banking sector once you have this lens. If you think about the global retailing landscape, of course, retail are really struggling, right? Because of COVID constraint, people couldn't visit malls and things like that. And again, it's not just Amazon are winning. In fact, if you're looking across the statistics about the share price performance again, there are the winners out there and there are the losers. Now, I'm going to ask you, guess who are the winner? Just put something on the chat box. Who are the winner? Here is the tips. It's not Amazon. Amazon is not on the list. Guess who are the winner of these top 3 companies despite the COVID crisis? They are recovering pretty much around their growth prospects. So Walmart is one. That's correct. eBay, I did not take into account because I consider them as digital native. Tesco, yeah, they're doing pretty well, but it's not one of them. Supermarket definitely is a great category. Zara is doing okay. It's not as bad as H&M, but it's not still a top performer yet. Let me review a little bit. Thank you so much for inputting. It's Walmart, Nike, and Target. Now, if there is one similarity across these guys, they are the one who really invest big time, ahead of time, on digitization. If you think about Nike, it's a really interesting case, right? Because before they even have an app linking to mobile phone, they have their own little sensor you can put underneath your sneakers to track how much miles you run. They were the one who understand the importance of direct to consumer rather than selling through middleman, the retailer in between. All these guys knows about the importance of data analytics from Walmart to Target. And so when the crisis hit, what we're seeing is organizations that have invested ahead of time, they now can reap disproportional benefit. In the case of Walmart, just like Amazon, they need to gear up this remote purchasing and so on. So what Walmart have done is to convert their 2,000 store over weeks into distribution centers. That's the kind of logistic network even Amazon cannot rival and compete against. That showed us the fate of company is not predetermined. In fact, the cautionary tale is if you don't prepare yourself and transform your business quickly, then you end up with a situation like Gap, Macy's, and JCPenney. Coincidentally, yesterday, Brooks Brothers also filing bankruptcy as well. This 180-year-old suit brand in the US couldn't survive. Again, it's because they have been ignoring what we call the secular trend for all too long. The obvious question everyone concerned about is why some companies are judged with a brighter future. And our answer is because they leap ahead of time. They know and understand where the world is moving. And so they prepare themselves and leap to a new know-how, core competencies ahead of time. Obviously, different sector would have new different frontier they need to leap towards. We mentioned a little bit about the banking sector, for instance. It's all about robo-advisory, AI, and blockchain and mobile services. In consumer packaged goods, it's direct-to-consumer, omni-channel, and e-commerce. But what Mark is going to bring us through is to understand there is all these changes around the demand side, equally important. There is all these changes around supply side. So it's complex, but there is a way for us to make sense this uncertain world with relatively easy model and framework. Mark.
Very good. So, yes. So I think I'd like to share two examples with you. And one is really focusing on the retail, on the demand side of how do we keep up demand in a time of a crisis? In other words, how do we create demand resilience? And then I'm going to have a really nice example on the other side of that. Once we have demand, but we need to produce it and supply it, how do we create resilience at the supply side? So I'm going to give an example in the retail world and in the manufacturing world. And again, feel free to ask any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll be monitoring this continuously. So the first example I want to give here is a very exciting company that you might not have heard of. It is $1 billion retailer in China, which is kind of like a Zara, if you like. It is the second largest collection of brands in China. They run 7 different brands. They have about 4,500 stores, brick and mortar stores all over the country. And, they employ tens of thousands of sales agents, sales employees. And you just have to imagine by the end of January, which was basically, the end of the Chinese year, the starting of the celebration of the Chinese New Year, people are ready for a holiday, people are ready to go, to stop working. And then at the end of the year, end of January to be precise, then the virus hit, the lockdown was introduced, people could not go to the shops, and obviously the shops could not open. So what do you do if you, in fact, run an offline brick and mortar retail shop? So what do you do? Well, the founder could have done what a lot of other companies are doing, and is basically say, I have all this clothes, all these shops, have all these people doing nothing. We need to let go of them because, basically, we cannot use these offline shops. So, what do we do with the sales employees? But they didn't do that. And that's really interesting because they really started and they said, what about we start with the bird that we have in our hand, which are all our employees that are sales agents. They happen to be offline sales agents. And then, what would be the answer to this dilemma? And the founder said, it's very simple, really, because the only thing that we need to do is we need to move everything online. We need to be able to sell what we now do offline to the online world. But then the problem came because the company and a lot of these sales agents, just, boys and girls all over China, they didn't really know how to do that. So then he said, maybe what we could do is maybe we could hire a consultant to do a marketing plan to figure out what channels and so on. And then the founder said, no, this takes too long. We have no time for that. We need to start tomorrow. So basically what he said, that the second day of the Chinese New Year, on January 26th, he says, from tomorrow onwards, all of you employees are going to sell online. And by the way, I have no idea how you're going to do that. Use your own experiences, because you're all consumers. You know how to work with social media. You're a consumer. You shop online as well. You figure it out. So basically what the founder said is, you go figure it out, and whatever you think works. Group buying, maybe we do a live streaming on the WeChat or an Instagram-like service. Just whatever you would like to do. And they started to do this. And the first day was actually their retail director that started to do this and attracted 100,000 people, really made their sales agents super enthusiastic. And then everybody said, okay, we can also do this. In February, they have sold more online than ever before. And it was a bit of a chaos, believe me. It was a bit of a chaos because they had to figure out the best practices. And they shared these best practices amongst themselves. And the company said the best practice, that gets most sales, well, we give them, him or her, a very large bonus. So what they really did was trusting, the birds in hand, basically all the employees they have, and actually very successfully moved to online selling. And the question here is, this is really nice, and we have all this live streaming and online selling, which was really very successful. But is this a China for China story? Is this only something that can happen in China? And actually, we did a bit of research there, and we find out, well, actually not. And there's a couple of really good examples. I just want to give you one example just that you know what we're talking about. For instance, coming back to what Howard referred to as Nike. So Nike has done remarkably well. All their stores, 5,000 stores, closed in January. And in January, which was the end of their last quarter, they still had a 5% increase in sales. Then over the whole first quarter, where basically everything was closed down, they only lost 5% of revenues in total. So basically, they very successfully moved online. And we've seen this with MAC, with cosmetics brands, really leveraging the live streaming as a tool of entertainment meeting commerce. And if we look at these cases, actually, it's really interesting because it's almost like a blueprint for how companies can keep up demand, or how they can create demand resilience. And here, of course, we're talking about the example of retail, but it's a very interesting case. It's a very challenged case. And the first lesson here for us, I think it's really about really quickly go to multi-channel marketing, jumping into that. And it doesn't matter. There's so many different options inside China, outside China. Just jump on those as quick as possible and kind of trust that your employees know what to do. And in fact, that's what they did, empowering the teams, basically telling them, you go figure this out. When you figure it out, you do it well, we give you a big bonus. And lastly, very interestingly, they did not give up on their offline channels either. They didn't stop, and start, shutting down shops and so on. In fact, they actually saw an increase in their offline traffic after the lockdown was raised. So a 4 times increase in online sales also led to a 2 times increase in offline sales. So also not the moment to give up on basically on the offline world. So this is one example, and this is a short example on retail, which really is about the demand resilience and creating demand resilience. But we also seen some questions in the chat. So other industries and other sectors. So I'm going to give you an example in the business-to-business world. So basically manufacturing. So at the manufacturing side, the supply side of this crisis. And here, I just want you to imagine that, you are a producer of products, and you need to, you be able to sell them. You need to be able to make the products. You need to be able to get all the components to build your products. And a lot of companies have this problem. I think about car companies, how I referred to earlier, but also think about, for instance, consumer appliances. So we're going to share an example of Haier, which is the largest consumer appliance brand in the world, also owns GE appliances. And surprisingly, this company has actually succeeded throughout the crisis to have a 99% delivery continuation. So they kept up production, they solved supply chain problems, and they kept actually delivering on their promise and selling, well, basically the washing machines and products that you can imagine that are consumer appliances. So the question here really is, and Howard and I did a bit of research on this topic, which we published with Sloan Management Review here. It's really about what made that this manufacturer could actually do that. And there's all kinds of answers to this, but the main answer, and the main answer we're going to find here, is actually in the organization chart. The way they organize and the way they design their organization. And here, really want to emphasize, this company, since the 1990s, has been obsessed with one thing, and that is how can we reduce the distance between us and our customers? How can we keep closer and make that as close as possible, because then we can respond very rapidly to all kinds of new demands and changes. So this has been an obsession, and it led them to basically rethink their organizational bureaucracy, which looks like kind of like a pyramid. And they said, we need to get rid of that. And today, Hire is organized almost like a swarm of a lot of small enterprises that are organized around a platform, which is then Hire. And this basically means that Hire is kind of a collection of 4,500 really small enterprises, where the leaders of those mini enterprises are in fact having the power of, well, basically a CEO. They don't ask approval. They don't need to report up the chain. They run it as is it's a kind of a small little enterprise, which obviously has full autonomy to make decisions. So now think about the crisis. Now you are faced with supply chain shortages. You cannot get the components to make your fridge. But now, actually, the answer is very simple. Because those small enterprises, let's say there's one small enterprise, has 60% is outside of China, let's say somewhere in Latin America. And then there is a problem with this component. We cannot get this component. What do? Well, this local small micro enterprise can say, hey, I have a nephew, I know an alumni, I know this other local company that for the next 3 weeks can help us to supply this particular component. So actually they can decide very quickly themselves on actually solving these disruptions in the supply chain almost autonomously. Now, if you think about that, basically the answer to their resilience is that in the way they organize their company, away from the bureaucracy towards more a set of small enterprises. Now, of course, not every company can organize themselves as Hire, and has done that for the last 20 years. But it's an important reminder that organizational design helps a company to deal with crisis and be responsive. But we see other examples, and here I'm going to give you a couple of short examples. For instance, Honeywell, a company that is not organized like Hire is, a much more traditional setting of an organization, but has been investing for a long time in remote working tools, which were kind of a nice thing to have, and was really basically kind of a nice increase of efficiency, but today actually has become a source of a competitive advantage. And lastly, we see companies like Mars and Alicat very much jumping and actually quicken the jump of using digital tools in their manufacturing base. Very interesting, for instance, Mars, they now use a company called Scope AR, which is augmented reality to help them with distance maintenance of factory problems. Or Alicat, which is a flow controller for liquid and gas applications, which uses a company called Ready Robotics, which is not about robots, it's about software that allows shop floor workers, people in a factory, very easily to program industrial robots themselves. So really, really nice interface. And they actually doubled their production during this crisis. So if we look at these examples, we see on the demand side of the story and at the supply side of the story, how companies create resilience. And some of them are, very much, prepared on the long run, and some of them are, a little bit closer to home. But of course, these are examples in retail, and these are examples not only in retail and in manufacturing, but yeah, in the end, these are just a couple of examples. So I'd like to ask Howard, besides this, is there something that basically any company could do?
Yeah, because if you think about that, obviously, if you're a manufacturer, most likely you would focus on the supply side. And if you are a consumer packaged brand, or you have direct access to consumer, you focus more around the first area of topic we just discussed, mostly around facing consumer. How do you change the way you engage your user differently? But here is one domain of changes I think organization, regardless of sector you're in, you can really think about, and is what I call the decision-making processes. So if you think for a moment right now, what's really interesting, we are really running a great experimentation to do everything virtually online. So the consequences is whether it's Microsoft Teams, whether it's Zoom, we're producing this enormous amount of digital footages. And there are organizations we have observed, they're using this tremendous amount of digital footages to unpack what we call tacit knowledge versus explicit knowledge. For instance, most organizations would always try to rely on a couple of people. They're great connector. They just know everybody. They know who's knowing who. Not necessarily they have the piece of subject expertise, but when a problem arises, you go to this super connector to find out who can help me out. Now, this is what we call tacit knowledge because it resides in the brain and the mind of certain individual, but not necessarily be codified into an organizational chart. So if you think about that, the problem with tacit knowledge is it could never scale. For instance, you could probably write down or Google how the Google search engine is ranking pages. It's explicit knowledge, it's a formula. But if I were to ask you to write a formula, how to close a tough deal, how do you negotiate a salary raise? Wow, it's pretty hard. That's what we call tacit knowledge. And so I like to point out these days, we've already seen organizations translating tacit knowledge to codified knowledge in search for high efficiency, productivity, riding on the wave of the COVID work processes. So let's go back in time a little bit because there are organizations who have done that long before Zoom, long before Microsoft Teams, guided by the idea and the principle of radical transparency. And the company I'm going to bring in is a slightly controversial, is Bridgewater, which is the largest hedge fund in the world. They were the only hedge fund during the last recession period which actually makes money when all the hedge funds actually were being, swept away. And the founder and the CEO at the time is called Ray Dalio. He is obsessed in one key question. He's obsessed with this idea of radical transparency because what he wants is to translate tacit knowledge into codified explicit knowledge. So inside Bridgewater, usually this is their management team meeting. What you see is before COVID, before Zoom, when they have a big meeting, the board members and exco would sit together. Everyone would have a microphone and also an iPad as well. The reason they do that is when the speaker is starting to talk, everyone around the speaker could already start to rate them across a number of categories that Bridgewater thought is really important. Things like teamwork, things that open to new idea, things like follow up with discipline on execution, etc., etc. These are usually contradictory requirements because usually a creative person may not be so good in follow up with execution. A big picture guy may not be so well in detail orientation, but that's okay. What Bridgewater want to understand is the profile of this individual, as well as allowing these individual speakers can gain feedback real time in a conference call so that they can course correct with their content. So what you're seeing is from the CEO all the way to a summer intern, as they speak in a conference room, everyone would rate each other. So what you see is no longer just feedback from one or two individuals, from a coach. But in fact, you get all this information from your peer in a big conference call. By the way Bridgewater pursue radical transparency is they would put all these video clips online for everyone to look. Now, this is pretty radical, and not all companies can do so because of sensitivity and so on. But again, for Bridgewater hedge fund, Ray Dalio thought making it transparent to everyone outweigh the risk of information leakage, since after all our employees have signed NDA anyways. So, of course, they don't just do it once, right? This is just the grid of one single meeting. But over time, as you go through more and more meetings, you have more and more evaluation. And then they feed into the algo through called dot connector. Over time, then they could already begin to assemble the executive profile on their strength and weakness as well. Are they open to new ideas, or they are very disciplined on execution? Because what Ray said, the most important thing is we have to get the right team mix, not by chance, not by opinion, but really by track record. and data and evidence. Because every time when you are becoming successful, you do require some form of mixed team. People who are open to new idea creativity, as well as people have discipline around. So of course these days, it feels a little bit like Black Mirror, right? It's kind of scary and some of us may not feel comfortable at all. But the idea is you may not want to retain this data. You can do it anonymously and come up with the algo. Just let the algo to recommend. Now your organization is facing this issue. Why don't you put together these candidates together to problem solve this issue? Or you can look back, who's know what.
Howard, can I just, well, one, I was thinking about what you just said about how intrusive people find that kind of approach in business, even if it can be anonymized apparently. But I wondered if we could just, at that point, just invite a few comments and live questions, do you think?
Absolutely. This is about time to describe, because before we show also, what are some of the latest development from MIT and Stanford? They are partnering with organization in experiment these type of approach. I think for executive, particular from the human resource community, we also need a point of view, because I bet the business side would have a point of view, but as professional having this identity, we also need to form our collective point of view going further. This is a great space at the moment.
Please feel free to ask your questions either in the chat or maybe even you can unmute yourself and
yes, please
speak up. It is in a small setting. So we already got a lot of questions on the chat that we try to answer while talking. Around hire, we had seen a couple of questions, but now of course the example of Bridgewater is, well, it's fairly controversial if you think about it. And how would you would you actually, maybe we can ask them a question, would you actually consider this kind of approach to get the benefits of being radically transparent in your decisions up until the CEO, and at the same time have the difficulties of are we comfortable with that kind of sharing? So if you're, please share your thoughts on this.
I remember while we're waiting for people to type into the chat box, I remember Ray in an interview with a Wharton professor, Adam Grant. He basically mentioned oftentimes we rely on highest paid person opinion, and he doesn't like that. He rather an organization could make decisions based on what he called believability. So he said there are many experts, there are many people who can articulate a logic, but they have actually no experience. And probably we also confounded with these kind of business situation. And he rather, whenever need to problem solve with certain expertise, he would pick people who would at least do that task successfully 3 times. Then he would call these guys, regardless of position of the organization, they are believable. Their opinion would actually be more value than a senior vice president of an organization who may not necessarily have the first-hand experience. So I thought that's pretty enlightening in a way to allow us to unleash the collective power of the organization rather than being hostage by a highest paid person.
I wonder if Will, would you like to, you made a point about psychological safety and you've asked a couple of questions. Would you just like to?
Yeah, I think Will here.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, great stuff. I'm really excited by the real-time feedback. I come from a background in sport originally, and feedback is kind of something that people get day in, day out, and we don't get enough of it in the business world. So tools that help make that easier are great, but of course it's got to be meaningful, and for me it has to sit on a foundation of psychological safety, i.e. everyone needs to understand that they are allowed to have different opinions, and they shouldn't be knocked down because they've got a difference in opinion. So creating a climate where healthy conflict doesn't get misconstrued as someone's not behaving in the right way would be a key element for me.
Yeah, and I saw a very nice comment from Nicolas on this. It's basically seeing what the role is of HR in creating psychological safety for that, to enable that kind of process. So would you agree, Will, that this is partly, the role of, what HR could play, or what would you think?
I think it can't be an HR thing. I think it has to be led by the business leaders. I think if it becomes an HR thing, reflecting from the true culture that's required in an organization. So the senior leaders have to embrace this themselves.
Right. But from a leadership side, you would say.
Absolutely.
I see a very nice question from Ali here regarding giving feedback. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Sure. Yeah, I'm interested in the Bridgewater example and getting this essentially real-time feedback. What are you also seeing regarding the year-end performance evaluation versus continuous feedback? How is this evolving? Because this is certainly something we're asking ourselves. The year-end performance appraisals are such a massive burden often on an organization. So how about that?
I know. I think what Ray Dalio has a very, despite he's a very demanding boss, so not everyone would want to work for him for sure. But he has this very objective assessment around why organization never learns. And he described, like, usually when we make a decision, like an investment decision, the result would happen 6 months later. And when you make decision, it's only based on limited information. So if you only judge an executive effectiveness based on the final outcome in terms of financial payback, it's unfair. What you want is to capture almost like how that decision is being made at that moment in time. Then 6 months later, you review the process. So he is quite rigorous in pushing one idea, is that there are times good outcome can be based on very bad quality decision making. There are sometimes bad outcome, but the decision making is really good. So this is why he always, before Zoom and Microsoft Teams, now that we can capture all this video conferencing call, he would bring a small team, proprietary team, to record all these major meetings when important decision is being made. And then they would have a small editorial team to distill what are the key decisions are being made, how that criteria is being established, what are the trade-offs at that moment in time, timestamp it. Then later on, you actually have the real data, unbiased evidence to do post-mortem. And it's not about political attribution, but it's more to do with how do we make sure collectively as an organization that getting into a learning path rather than committing ourselves to erroneous learning.
So I see, another couple of questions on, so if it's maybe not the HR or the business lead leading, but what could HRs do? And, we have actually an answer there, prepared for the end, so if you hang in there until the end, we have basically 5, main suggestions for you, what we think are really important. But in the meantime, we would also like to tell you that what Bridgewater is doing is in a way extreme and early and everything, but it is not just exclusive to Bridgewater. And to be honest, today, if you really look around in the market, there are so many tools available in the market today that could help with a lot of those aspects, and perhaps not as radical as Bridgewater. Just to give you a couple of examples here. So Zapier at the upper left. I don't know who knows Zapier. So you can put your hand up, the real hand. Yeah. Okay, so just a couple of people. So basically, this is a tool, very intuitive tool that what does it do? It integrates the use of all your applications. So think about, you get an email, your Gmail, with an attachment. It will then automatically upload that attachment to the Dropbox. And then from the Dropbox, it will send an alert in your Slack channel that you're working on a project. So it's actually automating the workflow. This tool is super simple. I'm sure the technology is not simple. The coding is not simple, but it is readily available that could be used. Another example is Cogito. Imagine I'm giving, I'm a sales representative. I'm a customer service person. I'm calling with a client. This is recorded live, and then on my phone, live in real time, it tells me, Mark, please slow down a bit. Or we hear in the tone of voice of the other side, there is an emotional cue. Could you please connect to the person? So it's continuously in real time telling me how to improve my customer service. So this, for instance, is used by MetLife, the company, and has actually led in one experiment an increase of 13% of their customer satisfaction. And the last example is something that we could actually have used today. AI Sense has a product called Otter AI, which is basically transcribing voice and video material. So imagine that every word that we have said today is captured in a text document. And suppose you do that for all the meetings we're doing, you could actually analyze this data and understand how our decisions made, who said what was actually the exact wording. It would actually open up a lot of the possibilities that perhaps Bridgewater has done already very early on, but it is already possible today. So at the moment, there is this availability. And I think as an HR professional, I think it would be very helpful to explore exactly these digital tools, because this does not require huge IT investment or difficulties to implement, because these are basically plug and play type of virtual work tools. So we wanted to give that as a couple of ideas. Then we also want to summarize a bit what we talked about today. And, just forgive me and forgive us for this ugly picture, but hopefully the content matters more than the beauty of the picture. But basically what we talked about, and in the circle, the concentric circle part of this is, creating resilience at the demand side was really very much about creating autonomy of those teams, the sales teams, and empower them to do and figure out what works best on the ground. It was also one level deeper. It was very much about creating that type of autonomy in the organizational design, an extreme case of hire, and don't get me wrong, it is an extreme case, but also how we can use all kinds of tools in the factory to make sure that we can keep our production up. And lastly, we discussed at the core, and this is basically what every organization can explore, is how to alter the decision-making process to make it more transparent and actually create more autonomy in that part of the organization. Now, that is a summary of the cases we discussed, but of course the consequences for you as HR professionals, but for organizations at large are, well, first of all, it means you need to rethink your KPIs. What KPIs do you give? Do you measure? And even the radical question is, do you want to have KPIs? So that's some organizations, increasingly, or a number of organizations are saying, well, we get rid of KPIs. So that's at least the question. The second one is, obviously, team diversity is really, really important, because if you think about an example like Bridgewater, I mean, it's very necessary to embrace this type of team diversity to be able to actually make that happen. Eventually, and lastly, this is really also about changing and altering the individual habits and routines of leaders. And for this, we have a couple of suggestions. Howard, would you like to share those?
Sure. These are organization things that they need to do, but it always comes back to individuals. And what I'm seeing these days is effective leader, they really need to embrace these 5, you could call it leadership trait or behavior along the way, in order to bring the organization to the next level, to bring the organization to leap. The first one is fueling this an abiding sense of curiosity. I just say read a lot, but obviously this is just one trick, because whether it's the former CEO of Pepsi, Coke, or Bill Gates, they really read a lot. The only reason for that is oftentimes executives get trapped with certain business logic that are very common within their own field. That is dangerous, because what we're seeing is organizations that are resilient, organizations can restore their fortune much faster than others. They go beyond the existing business logic. They go ahead with other competitors. It's this idea we need to understand the outside world in order to think ahead of time. Second is engaging in difficult conversation to arrive at a shared point of view. What you see is whether it's Walmart, Nike, or Pittsburgh, they are doing and making tough trade-offs. There are stuff that they need to let go. There are things that they need to emphasize from a business perspective. Unless the top team can engage in difficult conversation to arrive at a shared point of view, otherwise an organization will end up simply doing a lot of experiment with nothing being scaling up. These days, we have seen enough design thinking workshop, lean startup methodologies, but oftentimes the challenge is not launching another initiative. The challenge is based on evidence. How do we make tough trade-off and double down our effect or effort in areas that have a promising uptick? That requires difficult conversation to rumble in order to arrive at shared point of view. The third one is undertake new routine. What I'm seeing again is in the age of AI, in the time of crisis, executive needs to pick up new skill relatively fast these days. So oftentimes it comes down to re-altering one's routine. I had this conversation with the with the chairman of the group of a computer companies in Taiwan. The chairman told me every weekend now, I unblock my schedule in order to learn about machine learning, because I came from the world of hardware programming, right? You write code into a software. Today it's all about machine learning. You feed data and neural network and letting the computer to figure it out. These are new skills. He find himself must learn and master. So he changed his own routine in order to pick up a new skill quick. The next one is negotiating from a point of weakness. Obviously, under crisis, oftentimes you need to partner with people you normally don't partner with in order to ride out the wave. If you want to engage your partner within the ecosystem to drive new offering, oftentimes your partner may not be a weaker counterpart. In fact, you are the weaker counterpart. Big organizations tend to be very used to negotiate from a point of strength, but not so good from a point of weakness. So this is a critical skill or behavior I've seen, again, how organization can revitalize itself. Case in point, Disney right now is struggling, right? Because of all the theme park is being blocked. But then if you're looking at the share price, they're doing pretty well compared to other theme park and entertainment company, by the way. Now, not that they don't have challenges going forward, but they have prepared themselves ahead of time. And when Bob Iger, the current chairman and the former CEO, acquired Pixar, he was negotiating from a point of weakness. Steve Jobs doesn't want to sell Pixar to Bob Iger. He thought Disney's going to destroy Pixar's creativity. But from a point of weakness, Bob Iger sit down with the two co-founders of Pixar over to dinner to understand their psychic, to understand beyond monetary reward, what would make these guys tick. Ultimately, this is how he persuaded Steve Jobs to sell him such jewel towards Disney. Same thing for Marvel, in order to acquire all of these Star Wars franchise, as well as Spider-Man and all these major characters as well. The last is, again, declutter and prioritize. What you see is successful organizations are picking, doing what matters, and it requires priority. If any organization or any senior executive tells you more than 3 priority, according to Bob Iger, chairman of Disney, he said that means there's no priority. It's very easy to write out a 10-pager to say these are the stuff I need to do. It's much harder for an executive to narrow down to 3 top priority to do, which also gear towards the future. It's not about today, but pull the organization and the team towards the future. So Mark and I kind of saw these are the 5 major elements for leader to embrace in order to bring the organization also forward too.
Exactly. And I was thinking, Howard, we could perhaps ask some of the participants, if you look at these, these different practices, if you like, do you recognize this? Do you feel that you're ready for that? Or would you, I'm just really curious to hear some of the perceptions of the audience here. Is this like way out there, or is this like, hey, this is, we could do that? Please unmute yourself if you like, or note in the chat. Feel free to. You know what we do? We make it into a vote.
Yes.
So if you look at these principles as discussed, if we put hands up like this, like, hey, this is really something we can do. Thumbs up would be like, that's really good. And or maybe like, a little bit like this, or more a bit like this. I'm curious, these practices good? Hands up, or maybe a little bit further away, or maybe like far away. Yeah. Okay, very good. This is very good.
So as a follow-up after this fantastic webinar, what we're going to do is we'll send you a survey. So it's a survey that will measure you yourself, or if you ask your colleague to fill out, it would measure what we call the need for cognition. Essentially, we could measure how curious you yourself or your colleagues towards other sector as well. Because I think maintaining a sense of curiosity is really key. And it would have deep implication around which element of these 5 an executive would need to embrace more. So after this webinar, we will send you the online survey so that in a very quick few minutes, then you could have a gauge for your colleagues, should they pay more attention around curiosity, taking new routine and declutter, or they should focus more around engaging in difficult conversation and negotiate from the point of weakness, so that we could be more targeted around the intervention for leaders going forward. Just before we open up for more Q&A, we love engaging the audience, and we would love to stay in touch with all of you. So I know we are pouring out a lot of information to you right now. So maybe it takes a little bit of time to digest the briefing paper, to complete the survey, as well as some of the other thoughts that you have. But if you have any thoughts and ideas and wanting to engage a conversation, send us an email. We are always happy to take on the email. That is our personal website, and connect us on LinkedIn anytime that you like. But what a pleasure, right?
It was fun, and thank you for a lot of the great questions. And we still have in Swiss time 3.5 minutes. So if in 3.5 minutes we can perhaps have another 2 or 3 questions if there are, and otherwise over to you, John.
Can I just make a suggestion of picking on somebody, but Jenny Devalier, who's with us, I wondered, Jenny, you sit on a number of boards, whether you had started to observe some of those different leadership behaviours, leadership concepts that we just saw. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Hi, I'm here. I actually just typed a question into the chat box. I mean, my answer to that would be yes, but to varying degrees in different places according to the nature of the ask. I'm really interested in knowing from our speakers whether they are optimistic that leaders will rise to the new challenge.
So I just give you my opinion, and then and then we're gonna ask Howard as well. I mean, generally speaking, I'm a very optimistic person, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is I think this crisis has pretty much created a very strong sense of urgency that it's necessary. So I think that's the first thing. So, but that's an external component, right? There's kind of a push. At the same time, I do think that leaders have and understand a lot of this. I do think that they need to be supported sometimes by a slightly larger group within the organization, perhaps even the HR professionals to actually make that happen. So in my experience working with executives here, we sometimes feel that the executive actually sometimes feels a bit lonely in driving some of these changes. And I think that's maybe another component of that.
Yeah.
That's my take, please.
And I think in a way that COVID is an accelerant of business trend we talked about already, but it's also an accelerant of a wake-up call to senior executive. Because what I see is because of the crisis management team, usually you are led by C-suite executive to really almost like a SWAT team into different domain of the organization. Right now, this week is all about supply chain. Next week is about our dealership. The following week is about credit risk. And so they have this opportunity to deep dive into the organization and listen to the shop floor, listen to the millennial generation, listen to the junior staff member who have all these wonderful ideas and challenge their own thinking coming back. So it's kind of paradoxically, I see a lot of organizational energy getting unleashed right now. And I think it is almost a mission of this community, we collectively, to sustain that momentum and not to let it go.
Exactly.
Howard and Mark, thank you ever so much. I'm going to have to be very rude and cut across you because we're 1 o'clock. But thanks to you both for your generous and insightful presentation. And I think you've given us all some really practical advice for how we can support our businesses to prepare for navigating the long-term trends that we now face. I was also very impressed by your attention to production detail. So I think that's the first for us on CRF. And to the rest of you, thank you ever so much for joining us and for your insights and questions. We'll send out the post-meeting notes early next week. And we wish you all a great afternoon and a really good weekend. And thanks again, Howard and Mark, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank everyone.
Great to see all of you. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend.
Bye-bye.